Joining us on the line is Senator Ted Cruz, Republican of Texas, who's been very busy all around the Senate. He recently had a resolution on anti-Semitism that was approved by the full Senate. He had a hearing today on term limits. Senator Cruz, thanks so much for joining the show. Good to talk to you, sir.
Ben, always good to be with you.
And as always, a separate greeting goes forth to your beard, which is immaculately groomed. So let's start with the hearing that you held on term limits today. So you and a bunch of Democrats, too, I guess, were pushing for term limits. So what is the case exactly for term limits? I'm sort of torn on this one. So make the case for me. I'm torn on it simply because, my view is that there's nothing in the Constitution about term limits. If people want to keep electing the same people, that's people's fault. But what's the case for the term limit amendment?
Well, and I understand that sentiment. And as you know, the framers of the Constitution debated term limits. They didn't ultimately include it. I think we have seen Washington get corroded and get corrupted over now more than 2 centuries. And the case for term limits is essentially the case for draining the swamp. That Washington, there is a bipartisan problem of career politicians in both parties that come to Congress and stay here forever and ever and ever. They get in bed with special interests. They get in bed with the lobbyists. They grow government perpetually, and they stay in power. It's one of the things that drives out of control spending or out of control deficits and debt. And term limits, over 80% of Americans support term limits. And it's interesting, that cuts across party lines. That's true. The vast majority of Republicans support term limits, but also the vast majority of Democrats and independents. It's also the vast majority of African Americans and Hispanics. It's across racial and ethnic lines. The one group that doesn't support term limits is career politicians in Washington. And so today I chaired a hearing. I'm the chairman of the Constitution Subcommittee of the Senate Judiciary Committee, and I chaired a hearing on the constitutional amendment that I've introduced to impose term limits, to limit members of the Senate to 2 6-year terms and to limit members of the House to 3 2-year terms.
Well, Senator Cruz, one of the questions that I've seen kind of thrown at you on Twitter today is a question about your own willingness to how many terms do you want to serve? So I noticed that one of the things that's in the amendment that's proposed is that everybody who's currently there is grandfathered in. Presumably the goal there is to get people on board, because there are a bunch of people who may not actually want to be limited, but at least at this point have said, okay, we don't want that applied to us, but maybe we'll vote for that for the future. Do you think that is a problem of hypocrisy, or do you expect that folks who are currently serving in Congress should hopefully abide by these for them, voluntary term limits?
Look, in a perfect world, I'd love to see it be retroactive. And in other words, I'd love to see everyone capped at 2 years and out then. As a realistic matter, if this is ever going to pass, it is difficult to ask members of Congress to vote to throw themselves out of Congress. So you're right. I grandfathered it in. So it's 2 terms going forward for members of the Senate, or 3 terms going forward for members of the House, in order to try to get the support to get the amendment to the American people, so that the American people, if it gets to the states will ratify it easily. And in fact, if you look at the states that have adopted term limits, a number of states have adopted term limits. Virtually every one of them, the term limits came from a direct referendum from the voters, because career politicians don't want to limit their own power. And so grandfathering people in and making the clock only run forward was an effort I made to try to put this done. And today's hearing was intended to be a step moving in that direction.
Okay, so Senator Cruz, meanwhile, you have also sponsored this week, in the last couple of weeks, a resolution that condemns anti-Semitism. I know that was impossible for Democrats to get through the House, considering there are actual anti-Semites sitting in the House that would require some sort of condemnation. Instead, they passed this bizarre, broad-scale, everything that is bad resolution. Instead, in the Senate, you guys passed an actual resolution condemning anti-Semitism. Was that hard to get through? Did you have any kickback from your Democratic colleagues on that?
Well, it's an interesting question. As you rightly note, what's been happening in the House has been disgraceful, and it's been heartbreaking for many of us. We've got this trio of freshman House members who over and over again have been making comments that essentially recite anti-Semitic tropes that go back a long, long time. And in response to some of the more egregious comments by these House freshmen, Democratic leadership in the House, Nancy Pelosi, wanted to move forward with a straightforward resolution condemning anti-Semitism. Unfortunately, the Democratic caucus fractured on that. They couldn't hold Democrats together to condemn anti-Semitism. Instead, they watered it down to a general condemnation of all forms of hatred, all forms of bigotry against anything imaginable. Well, I thought we needed to be far more clear. And so the Senate, I drafted a straightforward, clear, and unequivocal condemnation of anti-Semitism. And my hope was that it would be bipartisan. And so one of the things I was very glad to be able to do is I worked with Tim Kaine, Democrat from Virginia, obviously Hillary Clinton's vice presidential nominee. And Tim Kaine and I worked together on drafting this. He agreed to work with me. And we got, I think it was 56 co-sponsors, including 14 Democrats in the Senate. And then on Thursday, Tim and I took it to the floor of the Senate to pass it. And it ended up passing unanimously, 100-0. So in the Senate, let me commend Senate Democrats. There are a lot of issues I disagree with Senate Democrats on, but every single Senate Democrat supported condemning anti-Semitism. That puts the onus squarely on the House and Nancy Pelosi, that Speaker Pelosi should take up the resolution that just passed the Senate 100-0, the bipartisan resolution condemning anti-Semitism. And the Speaker needs to take it for a vote, and the House needs to stand united with us, speaking against the evil that is anti-Semitism.
Well, Senator Cruz, speaking of folks in the House downplaying anti-Semitism, today we had the specter of Alexandra Ocasio-Cortez, who I know you've been trying to partner with on some legislation, so I don't mean to undercut all of that. But Alexandra Ocasio-Cortez, the great intellectual luminary of the House Democrats, coming forward in an Instagram post. I guess she was folding her laundry while doing politics or something. And in the middle of this rant about illegal immigration, she suggests that the United States is building concentration camps on America's southern border for illegal immigrants, and then utters the phrase, "never again." Her media defenders immediately come out and suggest that she didn't mean concentration camps. She just meant something else. She meant detention camps or something that's not Holocaust related. I don't know if you had a chance to take a look at the clip. What did you think?
Well, look, I do think it's a pattern we see a lot of Democrats doing, which is likening Republicans to Hitler is sort of their go-to. You and I both remember when George W. Bush was president, and Democrats would call Bush Hitler. Now with Trump, calling him Hitler seems to be almost obligatory on the far left. I think that really diminishes the grotesque evil that was the Holocaust. What Adolf Hitler and the Nazis did is unique in the history of humanity, with the genocide, with the extermination and murder of over 6 million Jews. And I think it belittles and weakens that horror to compare everything you disagree with, including something like actually securing our border and defending our national sovereignty. To suggest that's comparable with Nazi concentration camps is just not right.
I mean, Senator Cruz, one of the things I find so bizarre about all of this is that AOC, other House and Senate Democrats who are complaining about conditions down on the border, consistently refuse to grant the funding necessary to actually fund humane facilities for folks. I mean, Border Patrol is doing its best, but the fact is that DHS just does not have the money. I mean, Democrats deliberately have deprived DHS of the money for beds down at the border because they would prefer to see people released into the interior of the United States.
Look, that is exactly right. What we are seeing an absolute crisis on the border. My home state of Texas, of the 2,000 miles of border the United States has with Mexico, 1,200 of those miles are in Texas. And we're seeing the crisis. When I'm down on the border, I spend a lot of time on the border. When I'm down on the border in the Rio Grande Valley or all along the border, local officials there say they're being overwhelmed. And these are elected Democrats on the border, but they're saying the volume of illegal immigration is so overwhelming right now. In the month of May, we apprehended over 144,000 people crossing illegally in just 1 month, 144,000. And it is completely overwhelming the infrastructure, the ability to deal with it. And the position of congressional Democrats is essentially they're telling everyone, go jump in a lake. The president and the administration have asked for a supplemental funding bill of $4.5 billion to provide the resources to deal with this crisis on the border. And to date, congressional Democrats have said essentially, hell no, they're not willing to do anything. I hope that they change, that is really a heartless position. And my understanding is next week the Senate is going to vote on this. So we'll see where Senate Democrats line up. But right now, they're telling those children who are coming across the border that they're not willing to provide any resources that those kids, those families need, and that we need to secure the border and keep and stop this crisis.
And Senator Cruz, final question for you. Obviously, we're watching conflict, the possibility of conflict rising with Iran. We're hearing from members of the media that somehow it's controversial whether Iran is attacking things in the Gulf of Oman. Is there any real controversy about whether Iran is behind this? And are we leading up to a possible war in Iran?
You know, there is no real controversy. And I will say one of the saddest things we saw in the second term of President Obama is we saw this incredible politicization of foreign policy, and especially Iran. You know, when Obama's second term began, his deputy national security advisor said that he wanted an Iranian nuclear deal to be the Obamacare of the second term, which I think, oddly enough, he meant as a compliment. And what has come out publicly is they created what is essentially an Iran echo chamber of reporters who are leftists and think tank players who are leftists who began trying to deceive and dupe the public. And this echo chamber backed up the Obama-Iran nuclear deal, which I believe was the most catastrophic foreign policy deal of modern times. That same Iran echo chamber is now, as Iran is the world's leading state sponsor of terrorism, was caught red-handed using mines to take out
Senator
tankers.
Cruz,
that Iran echo chamber has
Senator
tried
Cruz,
to claim.
I'm sorry.
Can you hear me?
Yeah, I'm sorry. We actually have to run. We're at the end of the show, but I appreciate your time. We'll have you on again soon. This is The Ben Shapiro Show.